All right. What I want to talk about tonight is the idea of being completely sold out to God. What that means, what is required of us, what benefits we have of that, and what God's real desire is for us to be sold out to Him. And we're going to look at an example in the Old Testament, a great example. I love this story. It's in 1 Samuel. We're going to jump around a little bit in 1 Samuel, but I'm going to give a little back history for those who might not be familiar with the history of the Old Testament from the Exodus time until Samuel. So you have the Exodus. Israel goes into Egypt because they're going to escape the famine to get saved from it. They end up getting enslaved in Egypt after 400 years of slavery because Pharaoh forgets who Israel is and the family and how prominent they are to the past Pharaoh and Joseph and all that. In a nutshell, though, they become slaves, and then around 1220 by most scholars, some scholars say 1440 BC, so you're thinking 3,200 years ago, Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, and they wander in the desert for 40 years, and then at the end of their wilderness wanderings, they get to the edge of the promised land of the Jordan River. Moses dies, so their one leader dies. Moses commanded this entire place. And then he had a few, leaders under him like Joshua and Caleb and Aaron and stuff like that. But Moses and Aaron die. So they go into the promised land under command of Joshua. It's called the conquest, when they take over the land of Canaan and defeat all the Canaanite clans and people. And they take the land that God promised Israel a long time ago when he promised Abraham that his descendants would have it. So they're in the land. Once they get in the land of Israel, they start populating. They be fruitful and multiply. They take that and run with it. So they have a lot of people. They start setting up these towns and these cities and just different clan areas. Each tribe, there was 12 tribes of Israel. They divided the land up by each tribe, and they each had their own portion of the land of Canaan, which was now Israel. And because of this, they still only had one leader, pretty much, of the entire nation. And the nation was really big. It's bigger than what we see today, what we call Palestine or Israel today. It's very small compared to what it used to be back then. It used to go from like Euphrates River to the Dead Sea and stuff like that. It's a long, and wide country, not as big as the U.S. Either way, eventually we have these governing officials rise up and start taking command over Israel. And these are what we call the judges. They come from the book of Judges. Okay, and it talks about all of them. The last judge, the last official, they're more like a war official. They go out to war and they command the armies and stuff like that. But they're pretty much the lead guy for Israel. So they're like their president kind of thing. But they only have one leader. Now Samuel was the last leader of judges before we get to the kingship, when they elect a king. Okay, so Samuel is a prophet, a war guy, and he's leading Israel. When he's getting old, he's growing old. His sons are terrible guys. They are robbing people, robbing the priest of their inheritance and stuff like that. They're just robbing the nation of Israel. So they're crooked guys. They're unrighteous men. And Samuel has no successor. He has nobody to succeed under him. So this is where we get to, and Israel's in this dilemma. Their leader, Samuel, is aged and he's getting ready to die. He's older, and now they need a new leader. So they go up, and now we're in 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're just going to just do a few verses in the first few chapters here, and then we'll see how it pans out. But in 1 Samuel 8, reading verse 1 through 3, it said, "When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel." Okay, and that his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. See how his sons, he tried them out, but they just weren't worth it. They were crooked, and they didn't walk in the ways of Samuel. Samuel was a righteous man walking in the ways of righteousness. Now continue reading on a few next verses. In verse 4, "And then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons don't walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But this thing displeased Samuel. Because when they said, "Give us a king," he was displeased with it. And Samuel prayed to Yahweh, and Yahweh said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people and all that they say for you, for they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they have rejected me from being king over me." So what happens is Israel wants a king now. They understand that Samuel's getting old and he's not going to be around much longer. And they understand that his sons are crooked. They're not going to be worth having a king. They don't want someone like that. So they say, appoint for us a king like all the nations around us. At this point, Israel has never had a king. Remember I said that Moses led them out of Egypt. He was their commander. Then came Joshua. Then came the cycle of judges. There was never a king, okay? There was never a monarchy in the establishment of the nation of Israel until now, until they requested it. Thing is, though, what we could call Israel, according to what God wanted to be, what his idea of Israel to be is a theocracy. And what that means, it's not like a monarchy, it's a theocracy, which means the nation is serving a god. A god is the authority over the nation. You don't have to have a king, you have the God that commands everything in the nation. That's how God wants it to be. That's how he wanted Israel to be. But Israel didn't have it that way. They said, we want a king. Okay, that's why when Samuel got upset that they wanted a king, Samuel thought they were rejecting him. No. God said, no, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me as king because I am king, but they're insisting on a mortal king for a monarchy. God knew this was going to happen because back in the book of Deuteronomy, he lays out the rules for one day. He says, one day you guys are going to want a king, and this is what he's got to be like. Even though that's not what he wanted, he didn't want them to have a king. He said one day, this is in Deuteronomy 17, he said this is what he's got to be like. He can't do this, he can't do this, he's got to do this, and he's got to do this. He gave a line of kingship roles for the future king that he knew they would eventually want and request. So when they request a king from Samuel prays to God, and God says, okay, give it to him. And Samuel said, okay. Now we're going to get to the guy Samuel picks to be king, which actually God appoints him, and Samuel is the guy that has to put him as king. But now we're going to be in Samuel chapter 9, 1 Samuel chapter 9, the next chapter. I'm going to read just the first few verses in here. We're going to see who he chose as king, who God chose as king. So 1 Samuel 9, verse 1, there was a man of Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abel, son of Zeor, son of Bechorath, son of Aphoth, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth. Okay, he gave a little bit of a lot of genealogy there, but the guy he's wanting to be specific here is Kish. There's a Benjaminite named Kish, okay? And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he is. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than all of the people. Turns out, Saul, son of Kish, is the guy that God chooses to take over the kingship. He is going to be the first king of Israel. He's going to take the position of king. So you get down through here, and Samuel finds Saul, and he tells him, hey, God picked you to be king. You're going to be king. Okay? So Saul takes on the role of king. Samuel anoints Saul as the king of Israel, and thus we have the birth of the monarchy of Israel. Okay? First time ever we've got a king in the nation of Israel. And chapter 10 of 1 Samuel is going to be when he makes him king and stuff like that. Really good book if you want to read through it. It's an awesome book. So I know I'm skimming it here, but go read it for yourself if you'd like. So Saul is a pretty good king to start out. Saul goes out and he defeats the enemies that need to be defeated. He leads Israel into victory in war. He takes care of the people. Okay, but eventually stuff starts happening, and Saul's unfolding, is where we're going to get to here, and we're going to be talking about being sold out to God, because Saul is a good example of not being sold out to God, even though he had the perfect opportunity to be. So now, with a little lengthy reading, we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 15, the whole thing. And it's 30 some odd verses, 34 verses, but we're going to get through it. So we're going to start in verse 1, 1 Samuel 15. And Samuel said to Saul, Yahweh sent me to anoint you as king over his people Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way that they came out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child, infant, ox, and sheep, and camel, and donkey. Okay? So Amalek is on the hit list now, according to God. God wants him taken care of. So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 men on foot, and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in the weight of the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, Go, depart, go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. The Kenites departed from the Amalekites. And Saul defeated the Amalekites, the guys on his list, and Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. Verse 8. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatted calves, and of the lamb, and all that was good. It would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction. Okay, now, little overview here. What did God, through Samuel, tell Saul to go do? He told him, go defeat the Amalekites, everyone. He said, man, woman, infant, child, ox, sheep, donkey, everything. He said, kill them all. Why? Because when Israel was coming out of Egypt, like we talked about earlier, the Amalekites waged war on Israel and were hard on them, and they wouldn't let them come out. They became an enemy to Israel. God spared them back then, spared the Amalekites, but now he's taken revenge on the Amalekites through his king, okay, through God's king that he has set up for Israel. But Saul doesn't do that. Saul says, okay, I'm going to do this instead. He took the king of the Amalekites alive, and he spared all of the good sheep and the good cattle and all that. So you see where he's already messed up. Okay, so let's keep reading. We're in verse 10. Then the word of Yahweh came to Samuel. I regret that I've made Saul king. This is God saying that. He said, I regret that I've made Saul king. For he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to Yahweh all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told to Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he has set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul. And Saul said to him, Blessed be you to Yahweh. I have performed the commandment of Yahweh. And Samuel said, this is kind of funny, and Samuel said, well, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? And Saul said, well, they've been brought from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to Yahweh your God. And the rest we have devoted to destruction. Then Samuel said to Saul, stop. I will tell you what Yahweh said to me this night. And he said to him, and Saul said to him, well, speak. And Samuel said, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not head of the tribes of Israel? Yahweh anointed you king over Israel, and Yahweh sent you on a mission and said, go and devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why did you not obey the voice of Yahweh? Why did you not pounce on the soil and do what was evil in the sight of Yahweh? And Saul said to Samuel, I've obeyed the voice of Yahweh. I've gone on the mission which Yahweh sent me. I've brought Agag the king of Amalek, and I've devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to Yahweh your God in Gilgal. See how he put the blame on the people at that point? And Samuel said, has Yahweh so great in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Has he so great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, it's better than sacrifice to obey, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is an iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king. If you read the rest of the story, Saul falls apart. His kingdom falls apart, and eventually Saul gets killed, and David becomes king. And then we have King David. Is everybody probably more familiar with King David than King Saul? David's the second king of Israel because Saul didn't do the best job. So, a little overview. I want to mention Saul is given this commandment directly from God through his prophet Samuel. Go and kill the Amalekites, all of them, every single one of them, and all of their cattle. Just destroy the entire place. Saul, you can do it. You took 200,000 men and then 10,000 more. You can do it. Destroy them. So Saul says, okay, I'm going to go do it. And he goes and he does most of it, but he brings back the king alive, which was supposed to be killed, and all of the good sheep and the good donkeys and the good cows and stuff like that, so he can sacrifice them to Yahweh. That's not what God said. God said kill them. He said devote to destruction and just kill them. Okay? So, and if you'll notice, what did Saul say when Samuel spoke to him? He said, I have brought, and this is back in verse 15. And Saul said, they've brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to Yahweh your God. Now I don't know if this is the scribal intention here to portray the fact that Saul had already forsaken God, because he didn't say, I'm going to sacrifice to Yahweh our God or my God. He said, your God. Okay? This is a foreshadow of what happens. Saul completely abandons God and does his own thing. And this is the first unwinding. But I want to show you something relevant now to what we can take this for. We can understand this. Saul was the guy. He was the guy to choose for this position, for king of Israel. Okay? Whenever we first got introduced to Saul back in chapter 14, I'm sorry, chapter 9, we get told a few things about Saul. One, he's a Benjaminite. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. The thing about the tribe of Benjamin, out of all 12 tribes of Israel, they were the smallest tribe because they almost got wiped out in the book of Judges. But they were the fighters. Benjaminites were actually left-handed people, because the method for when they would train up their soldiers when they were young, they would tie their right hands behind the boy's back and teach them to fight with their left hand. Why? Because when you're fighting, back then, you fought with sword and spear and shield and stuff like that. To have a right-hander and a right-hander fight was common. Okay, it's expected. You know how to counter a right-hander and stuff like that. But left-handers have that little edge. Like even in boxing today, left-handed boxers, like it's hard to fight one because you're so used to everybody coming from the right side, but when they come from the left, it catches you off guard. Well, Benjaminites were fighters. They were trained as left-handed men to fight and to have an upper end. So he was a fighter. We need a good fighter for king, right? Like I said, he was the smallest of all the tribes, Benjaminite. Okay? So he had to overcome the odds. He wasn't chosen from the tribe of Judah, the biggest tribe, or Levi, the priestly tribe, or Naphtali or anything like that. He was chosen from Benjamin, which means he had to overcome odds. That's a small tribe. That's very few people, but he overcome the odds and he was chosen for that. Also, remember how I said he was handsome? That's an Old Testament way of saying this guy looked the part. This guy was an attractive guy. It wasn't trying to portray him as just like, well, he's just a really good-looking guy in terms of like, relationships or something like that. But this guy was, he looked the part to be king. He had the model, like he was just the prototype for king. He was tall. Remember it said that from his shoulders up, no man stood. So he was shoulders taller than everybody in Israel. That's a lot of people back then. He was the tallest guy around. And he saw himself as little. He doubted Samuel when Samuel said, you're going to be king. He said, me? Me? The reason, what he was doing when Samuel found him, he was looking for his sheep, for his dad Kish. And he's like, you want me to be king of Israel? Whatever. So he was humble at the same time. So he was a fighter. He overcame odds. He looked the part as handsome. He was tall, like a warrior, and he was humble. This was the guy. You couldn't have picked a better guy to be king. He had all the right attributes externally and some internally that you would need to be king. But he failed. Okay? He gets anointed as king. He deliberately disobeys God. He immediately, he's given clear instructions. God said, kill him, devote to destruction. He completely disobeys God's commandments. and then has the audacity to say, no, I obeyed the commandments. And then he puts blame on the people when Samuel says, well, what's this bleating of sheep I hear? He said, well, the people, the people spared them. So he's kind of gotten himself in a hole. Now, to do this, he built an altar, okay? When he came back from fighting the Amalekites, he built an altar and was sacrificing all the sheep and the cattle and stuff on it as a public display. This was to display his arrogance. This was his arrogance displaying his deed, that he had went and he had conquered the Amalekites in Agag, and he had killed this people and even had their best of sheep come back so he could sacrifice them to Yahweh. So this was kind of haughty. So he's honoring himself in this situation and not God. But the key verse that I wanted to really stress on is at the end when Samuel addresses him. Going back to 1 Samuel 15, chapter 20, or 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22. And Samuel said to Saul, has Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying his voice? Behold, it's better to obey than sacrifice, and listen than the fat of rams. Saul was set up for success, okay? But because Saul let Saul get in front of him, instead of doing what God wanted, he did what Saul wanted to do. He fails and is stripped of kingship of Israel, which was a God-appointed position. Saul wasn't sold out to God. He was sold out to himself, even though he had everything he needed to succeed. The way we can take that into our life is we might be blessed beyond measure with something in our life. We might have our dream job. We might have a wife and kids, a family. We might be financially set for the rest of our life, retired. We're set up for success. I know there's a lot of people out there that set up for success. But we have to remember that we're put in these positions by God and for God. And there are consequences if we don't recognize that and understand that and accept that. Because the man who is happily married with a family, if he goes after his own eyes and goes and has an affair, he could destroy his entire family, even though he was set up for success. He had everything he needed. He was the head of his household. He was financially stable. If he goes and has an affair, then he could lose everything he's got, just like Saul did. A professional athlete, or a college athlete, let's say this, a college athlete doing good in college too, in his classes, his or her classes, has everything going for him. Financially, they're going to get a good job afterwards, playing sports, doing great, or any extracurricular activity, whatever you want to consider. But then they go out and they make this bad decision against God's will and says, well, I'm going to go to this party, and I won't do nothing bad or anything, Goes to this party and they end up getting pressured into doing drugs or something. Party gets raided. He or she goes to jail, loses all scholarships, gets kicked out of school, and then is flat on his or her butt saying, what can I do now? I was set up for success. I had everything going for me, but I didn't succeed. And that's because they didn't put God first. So when we look at Saul, Saul was a great king before this event. And Saul did a lot of good. Actually, Paul in the New Testament is named after Saul. They share the same name. But Saul, in his success, decided, well, I'm successful enough that I don't really need to listen to God anymore. And that cost him absolutely everything. That cost him the kingship. His reputation was ruined, and he lost his life because of it. He was killed fighting the Philistines. And then someone after God's own heart, David, King David, took over and picked up the kingship that Saul had. And eventually David actually goes after his own eyes too and has an affair with Bathsheba. And from then on, David starts unwinding too. So we can look at these people and we can see the good in them in our Bible and the characters in our Bible. But we also have to learn from what the authors of the scriptures want to tell us. And that is, in the case of Saul, you can be set up for complete success and you can have everything going for you. But you can't forget that God let you do that. God allowed you to be successful. God allowed you to have what you have. And if you forget that and start going after your own eyes, then God's going to take his hand off the situation. He's going to let you really take control of it. And pretty sure it's always going to end in a bad situation. You're going to fail. It's not going to be a successful story. So in our lives, the way we can apply this, understand all the time that everything that you have, all success that you have is God-given. And that what we need to do, we don't need to be sold out for ourselves. We need to be sold out to God. God gives and he takes away. As Job would say, blessed be the name of the Lord, of Yahweh. And we need to understand that he can take away in a snap. And we have to always be on our guard to obey him, to guard him, and to do what he wants us to do, and to live the life, the righteous life that he wants us to live. Yeah, we're not king of Israel. We're not president of the United States. But that's not, you don't have to be. Anything in your life, you need to make sure you put God first and foremost in it. And be sure that you understand that he is the one that gives it to you. And to not go out on your own way and to think, well, I can do this myself now. Because I promise you, it will not end good. But if you do stay with God, and you do listen to him, and you do follow him, and you do obey him, and you do sell out to him, then he'll buy into you. James says, draw close to God, and he will draw near to you. And you will be okay, and you'll be successful. I can promise you that. So take this, maybe read through the book of 1 Samuel on your own, 1 and 2 Samuel. It's a great book. Absolutely love the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. Because I'm sure you can get more out of it than what I've talked about tonight. But just take this and try to apply this to your own life. And I promise that God will honor your application of it, and he will help you if you sell out to him.